While a complete history of regional rivalries and diplomacy would cover numerous cases across the globe, here's an overview of some key historical periods and examples that illustrate the evolution of regional rivalries and diplomatic strategies. Ancient and classical rivalries. Greek city-states, 5th century BC. Rivalries. Athens versus Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. Diplomacy. Greek city-states were often in conflict with one another, but also engaged in alliances like the Delian League, led by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta. These rivalries shaped Greek politics, and the balance of power was crucial in diplomacy. Treaties and alliances were often temporary or based on common enemies. Rome and Carthage, 264 to 146 BCE. Rivalry. Rome versus Carthage during the Punic Wars. The rivalry was based on territorial expansion, trade dominance, and strategic interests. Diplomacy. While the Romans initially attempted diplomatic solutions, the rivalry eventually escalated into full-scale war. Diplomacy was a tool used to manage early tensions, but ultimately military dominance prevailed. Medieval and early modern rivalries. The Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453. Rivalry. England versus France. Diplomacy. Diplomatic maneuvering, alliances, and marriage were key strategies. For example, the English royal family used marriages to secure alliances with other European powers. Treaties like the Treaty of Picquigny, 1475, attempted to end conflict but were often temporary solutions in a long-standing rivalry. Ottoman Empire versus Safavid Empire, 16th to 18th century. Rivalry, a religious, territorial, and military rivalry between Sunni Ottomans and Shia Safavids. Diplomacy. Both empires used diplomatic marriages, alliances, and treaties to secure advantages, though warfare was often a prominent feature in their relations. The rivalry was rooted in both geopolitical and sectarian conflicts. Spanish and Portuguese empires, 15th to 17th century. Rivalry. Over colonial dominance in the Americas and Asia. Diplomacy. The Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, was a diplomatic effort to divide the New World between Spain and Portugal, ensuring peace in their competition for overseas territories. Colonial and imperial rivalries. The British and French empires, 17th to 19th century. Rivalry. Over colonial holdings, particularly in North America, India, and Africa. Diplomacy. The rival empires engaged in a series of wars, e.g., the 7 Years' War, but also tried diplomacy, as seen in treaties like the Treaty of Paris, 1763, and the Congress of Vienna, 1815. Diplomatic efforts included territorial exchanges and balancing power in Europe and overseas. Sino-Japanese rivalry, 19th to 20th century. Rivalry. Imperial expansion in East Asia, culminating in the Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. Diplomacy. Japan and China used diplomacy both to avoid and escalate conflicts. Japan's imperial ambitions clashed with China's declining Qing dynasty, leading to Japan's victory and the Treaty of Shimonoseki, where China ceded Taiwan to Japan. 20th century rivalries and the age of diplomacy. World War I, 1914 to 1918. Rivalry. Major European powers, particularly Germany, Britain, France, and Russia, with alliances like the Triple Entente versus the Triple Alliance. Diplomacy. A delicate balance of alliances and diplomacy failed to prevent the outbreak of war. Post-war diplomacy, particularly at the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, sought to resolve many of the territorial issues, though it also sowed the seeds for future conflict. Cold War, 1947 to 1991. Rivalry. The United States and the Soviet Union. Diplomacy. This was perhaps one of the most defining periods of rivalry in modern history, characterized by the nuclear arms race, proxy wars, e.g., in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and the competition for ideological and political influence. Key diplomatic events included the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, the SALT treaties, and the eventual easing of tensions through détente. Arab-Israeli conflict, 20th century, present. Rivalry. Israel versus several Arab nations, particularly Palestine, Egypt, and Jordan. Diplomacy. The rivalry has included a series of wars: 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, but also peace efforts such as the Camp David Accords, 1978, and the Oslo Accords, 1993. Diplomatic efforts continue today to resolve territorial and political disputes. India versus Pakistan, 1947, present. Rivalry. Originating from the partition of British India, the rivalry has been shaped by territorial disputes, particularly over Kashmir. Diplomacy. Though there have been several attempts at peace, e.g., the Simla Agreement in 1972, the relationship has remained tense, with multiple conflicts, nuclear proliferation, and sporadic diplomacy. 21st century rivalries and diplomacy. China versus the U.S., 21st century. Rivalry. Over global economic, technological, and geopolitical influence. Diplomacy. The rise of China has led to a strategic rivalry with the United States, particularly in trade, technology, 5G, AI, and military presence in the Asia-Pacific region. Diplomatic tensions manifest in trade wars, e.g., the U.S.-China trade war and military posturing in the South China Sea. Russia versus the West, post-Soviet era. Rivalry. Particularly after the annexation of Crimea, 2014, and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, Russia has had strained relations with NATO and the EU. Diplomacy. Despite frequent tensions, diplomacy continues, though it is often marked by accusations of interference, e.g., in U.S. elections and military confrontations. The Minsk agreements were an example of a failed diplomatic attempt to end the conflict in Ukraine. Middle East rivalries. Rivalry. Saudi Arabia versus Iran, particularly over influence in the region, sectarian issues, Sunni versus Shia, and the control of strategic areas like the Strait of Hormuz. Diplomacy. Diplomatic efforts have ranged from direct negotiations, e.g., the Iran nuclear deal or JCPOA, to proxy wars, Syria, Yemen. Ongoing peace initiatives and tensions persist in the region, with shifting alliances and interests.